In my opinion, few video games in history deserve as much celebration as that of Double Dragon. In fact, a strong case can be made that this is one of the most historically significant and impactful titles ever published, with the franchise going on to shape the entire beat-em-up genre as we now know it. Not bad at all for an old, rough around the edges arcade game that almost certainly has its fair share of flaws in places. However, holding such thoughts in mind, join me today as we discuss the iconic Lee brothers' first adventure, look at their contributions to gaming culture, and what exactly it is about Double Dragon that, in spite of any shortcomings, makes it just so damn special. So with all of that said, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Let's take a wild trip back to the 80s and experience the birth of this groundbreaking brawler. This is the arrival of Double Dragon, an arcade game that stood head and shoulders above all others. Yeah. By the way, congratulations on finding this video. I released depthy uploads covering all sorts of retro favourites, so if you love Double Dragon and old bugger games like this, then hit that subscribe button right now. Don't be grumpy, I'll try my best to entertain you. Let's get going. In recent years, the beat-em-up genre has been experiencing somewhat of a renaissance period. Games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, Streets of Rage 4, and the River City Girls games have proven both critically and commercially successful alike. Part of these modern classics' charm certainly relates to how easy to pick up and play they can feel, offering simple controls that allow gamers to focus on the action rather than learning complex button combinations or sitting through long-winded cinematics or tutorials. Essentially, what they offer up is the polar opposite of what we get from most AAA titles today, functioning as awesome breaths of fresh air. Not only that, for many players, beat-em-ups are associated with nostalgia, fond memories of childhood arcades or long nights spent with friends. The Golden Axe series, the Streets of Rage franchise, and the many arcade classics released by Konami would all offer up this same style of goodness. In common, these games are quite challenging, require quick reflexes, strategic thinking, and the mastery of the game's mechanics. Teaming up with friends and working together to take down waves of enemies can be tough but very rewarding, providing a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction that only an arcade-style beat-em-up of this kind can offer. Whether you are playing one of the 90s classics like The Simpsons or X-Men Arcade, or enjoying an indie great like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World or Mother Russia Bleeds, one thing is for sure, they all need to thank their existence to Double Dragon. This was the video game that established two-player side-scrolling cooperative brawlers, so it is without question that the original, developed by Technos Japan way back in 1987, introduced many of the conventions we associate with all of beat-em-up's biggest hitters. As impressive as an innovation this was though, obviously no new concept is completely drawn from thin air, so let's examine the road on how we got to this hit. In relation to such a journey, let's start with Technos Japan themselves. In the earlier portion of the 80s, Technos were already one of the forerunners in creating video games that included hand-to-hand combat. Examples include Karate Champ and Tag Team Wrestling, two 1984 games that the company made that were far more impressive than, say, simply Boxing, published by Atari 4 years earlier. Other interpretations of fighting in video games would shortly follow. A small company known as Nintendo, for example, would come a step closer to the beat-em-up genre, with a little entry known as Urban Champion, which would take combat to the streets for the first time, essentially establishing the street fighting trope in gaming. Even more impressively, just 1 month later, a man working at IREM would come up with something even better, the extremely well-designed Kung Fu Master, a game that contained a groundbreaking combination of both fighting and side-scrolling. Worked on by Takashi Nishiyama, the same man who would later land a job at Capcom, birthing a minor fighting game franchise known as Street Fighter, this earlier work of his is considered by some to be the world's first beat-em-up. However, it is clearly very different from Streets of Rage, Final Fight and all of the other most famous examples we celebrate so enthusiastically. So we are not quite at the Double Dragon stage of beat-em-ups in our tale quite yet. But we are certainly a step closer, so let's visit 1986 to discuss what would unfold next. Circling back around to Technos Japan, we are brought to a man known as Yoshihisa Kishimoto, and the release of a game known as Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun. Localised and reskinned as Renegade in the West, the original game in this series would break all sorts of new ground. Loosely based on Kishimoto's life in high school, where he claims he was always fighting over girls, and paired with his love for Enter the Dragon, Kunio-kun certainly had a unique gaming aesthetic to it. Whether you were playing as Kunio, the hot-blooded Japanese high school student in the original, or playing in the warrior-inspired reskin of the game, there is no doubt that this one influenced Double Dragon and the modern beat-em-up in many ways. But there were still some key ingredients missing which meant we weren't there yet. You see, while Kunio-kun contains side-scrolling and fighting, like in Kung Fu Masters, and the fighting is taken onto the streets, like in Urban Champion, Kunio-kun was still not the prototypical side-scrolling beat-em-up. This is because, upon closer inspection, rather than scrolling from one point in the stage to the next, each level is just essentially a large arena you can move back and forth and fight in. Pair this with a lack of cooperative play, another layer of the modern beat-em-up still needed to be conceptualised. But at least we got the debut of whip-wielding dominatrixes and angry bikers, tropes that remain heavy fixtures in this genre to this day. So, thanks Kishi. Speaking of this now legendary figure within the gaming industry, we finally reached 1987 and the birth of Double Dragon itself. Using the groundwork that he'd established in the Ketsu Koha Kunio-kun, still working for Technos, Kishimoto and his team would design and release Double Dragon. In the game, players take on the role of twin brothers Billy and Jimmy Lee, as they fight their way through the streets of a post-apocalyptic city to rescue Billy's girlfriend Marion from a gang called the Black Warriors. The gameplay involves punching, kicking and using various weapons to defeat enemies as the player progresses through a series of levels, each with its own unique challenges and bosses. Double Dragon was notable for its two-player cooperative mode, where two players could play simultaneously on the same screen and work together to defeat enemies. This was a novel concept at the time and helped make the game popular with arcade goers. The two-player change in play meant that the game would be the most successful in the genre yet, shaping future beat-em-ups as we know them for many years to come. Billy and Jimmy Lee, hilariously localised as Hammer and Spike in the West, were two radical dudes whose fans would instantly fall in love with them. The game for its time would be well damn layered. Combat was more refined than anything seen in gaming as of yet, with players being able to perform martial arts moves using a joystick paired with 3 buttons for kicking, jumping and punching. These buttons allow players to perform moves from the most basic attacks to throws and elbow strikes. Revolutionary double team attacks were also possible in the game. For example, one player can grab an opponent from behind, allowing the other to pummel them mercilessly. Enemies can even do this to the player too, meaning that combat must be taken in with caution. These innovations gave players a lot of flexibility in combat and made the title feel engaging and strategic. Double Dragon was also one of the first games to allow players to interact with the game's environment in meaningful ways. Players could pick up weapons like baseball bats and rocks, and they could also use objects in the environment to their advantage, like throwing enemies into barrels or off of ledges. The game was also the first ever beat 'em up where a player could knock a weapon out of an enemy's hand, pick it up and use it against them. This feature was invented for Double Dragon, and a wide array of weapons can be used within. The action would also bring to the table challenging boss fights at the end of each stage. These require players to use all of their skills and strategies to defeat them. This helps make the game more exciting and memorable, setting the standard for boss fights in many beat-em-up games that were to come. The basic mechanics also include many other elements you would associate with the beat-em-up genre. Characters have life gauges that deplete when they take hits, and life can be lost if stages are not completed within a time limit. Additionally, deaths can happen if players fall down pits or holes. Rudimentary now, but again, think of how old this game is. Another vast improvement from Kunio-kun that came before this is that the arcade version of this game could display an incredible 384 colours on screen at once, available from a 4096 colour palette. This stunning for its time game was all possible due to the arcade hardware using several 8-bit microprocessors running in parallel, along with the multi-processors dedicated to just sound, all in all delivering one hell of an arcade experience in its heyday. Now we have been through many of the fantastic innovations that this amazing video game introduced to the world, so I guess it is now time to address the elephant in the room, this title's biggest and most glaring flaw: the ridiculous amount of slowdown that takes place throughout playthroughs. Large amounts of slowdown can be experienced as you make your way through this post-apocalyptic world, with the game generally becoming slower anytime more than 2 character sprites appear on the screen simultaneously. As you can imagine then, playing this one cooperatively results in an even slower affair. A crying shame considering that co-op was this game's biggest selling point. As you progress and more enemies show up in shot, as one can probably imagine, such issues only get worse. Fortunately, bootleg versions of the game were created with a lot less slowdown, and modern hacks and interventions, like which were implemented across a lot of the footage we are showing today, can result in a far smoother experience. So at least we have ways to circumvent this problem now. Aside from this major issue, other criticisms that are often pointed out regarding this game relate to some of the moves that are executable in this one. The elbow smashes are extremely overpowered and can render other moves a bit useless. A jumping back kick has severely limited range, and the headbutt programming was a bit off, leaving players vulnerable to being attacked. This is without even taking into account some of the enemy characters' poor AI, which often sees themselves comically getting blown up by their own dynamite. But regardless of any of these shortcomings, back in 1987, not one of these problems was enough to stop crowds of people from queuing up and gathering around cabinets to play this game. Consumers had never seen anything quite like Double Dragon. Everything about this arcade game now feels iconic, from the opening scene that sees Marion getting punched in the gut, to the imposing Abobo first smashing through a wall. Everything that happens in this game echoes through history. The day Billy and Jimmy first took to the streets to save the damsel in distress delivered to us a genre-defining affair, popularising raging through the streets, taking on obligatory whip-wielding dominatrixes. Speaking of which, something has always confused me about this. Why are these women in these games giving away their services for free?
Sex. Fetish. Yeah.
Anyway, throughout a playthrough of this arcade classic, the game does a great job of providing variety, while also training and challenging the player simultaneously. The game begins in the slums of a city where the Lee brothers must fight their way through a group of thugs. The stage is relatively easy and the enemies are not too difficult to defeat, providing a smooth learning curve for newcomers. The second stage takes place in an industrial area where the brothers face tougher opponents, such as bikers and construction workers. The stage features conveyor belts and other obstacles to add to the difficulty. The third stage in the game seems to take place as players exit the industrial building, giving the game a feeling of continuity, leading to a woodland area where more skirmishes with enemies occur. Here the Lee brothers must fight their way through a forest while avoiding obstacles such as logs and boulders. The enemies in this stage are tougher than in the previous stages, and there are more of them. Next, the Lee brothers must cross a bridge while fighting off more tough enemies, including knife-wielding foes. A green Incredible Hulk-like opponent guards the door on the mountain side at the end of the stage. Once inside the doorway, players arrive in a temple-like area full of booby traps to avoid that hinder stage progression. There are more enemies here than any other stage thus far, some of which even smash through the walls located in the background. When players finally reach the end of a stage, players find Marion strung up on one of the walls. In this section, players take on wave after wave of enemies, as the crime boss, who is accurately named Machine Gun Willie, watches on maniacally with a machine gun from the balcony above. Considering this section of the game has the most characters on screen simultaneously, this is the point where slowdown reaches an all-time high. But after a lot of effort, Machine Gun Willie and his minions are finally defeatable. But while this is the case, in one more twist and innovation, the Double Dragon arcade game still has one more trick up its sleeve. Rather than helping the poor tied up Marion down, players controlling the two brothers have the opportunity to fight to the death, with the winning brother getting the girl. When we consider that the Lees are siblings, it's pretty messed up. Such a bizarre ending really, particularly when we take into account that Marion just kisses the winning brother and wishes they may live happily forever. Maybe Marion is afraid that she is about to get murdered too. As zany as this was though, can we at least admit that such an ending is pretty epic, and further proof of how different Double Dragon was to anything that came before it. This arcade game no doubt helped set the tone for all the beat-em-ups that were to come. It's simplistic yet highly addictive, the controls are tight and responsive, and the game's music, composed by Kanazanuka Yamane, remains one of the most memorable soundtracks in video game history. It provides the perfect match for Double Dragon's intense action, featuring catchy beats and driving rhythms that got players pumped up and ready to fight. Overall, Double Dragon is a classic arcade game that still holds up today. Its graphic, gameplay and music are all excellent, and they combine to create an experience that is both challenging and fun. But what for the home ports of this madness, which were obviously soon to follow? The game would end up being released on many of the most successful home platforms of this era, meaning that the Famicom/NES port of the game was a no-brainer for Technos Japan. Arriving on the platform in 1988, the system would eventually end up receiving something that was actually quite different from its arcade counterpart. The NES version only allows one player to play at a time, which was bizarre really for a game with the word double in the title. To make up for this sad omission, the title's storyline was vastly altered to help fit a single player adventure. This must be Single Dragon, eh? This time around, gamers can only play as Billy Lee on a quest to save Marion, with Jimmy Lee serving as the game's main antagonist and true leader of the Black Warriors gang, which at least means the brawl at the end makes more sense this time. Further to this, the NES version features a different storyline and levels compared to the arcade version. Some of the stages in the NES version are exclusive to that version, while some stages from the arcade version are omitted or altered in the NES one. Double Dragon was only the second game that Technos developed for the NES, hence why the game was lacking in many features future NES games from the same genre would include. The game's holes meant that only 2 enemy sprites can appear on screen at once, and both of these enemies needed to be the same sprite, but duplicated. Weapons also disappear in this version once enemies who held them are defeated, but at least a few new mechanics are included to make the game more console friendly. These included a new RPG-like leveling up system with 7 skill levels to unlock, so at least there was that. Arguably, the most striking difference in this version, aside from the graphical changes themselves, is that the level design throughout is very different to its arcade counterpart. Some stages feature all new areas, and there is a strong emphasis on platforming and evading traps. I guess Super Mario Bros. Fever had swept the console, so every video game was taking influence from it in some way or another. A feature known as Mode B was also included, whereby gamers can play as Billy or many of the title's other enemies and compete against a double of their own character in one-on-one matches. In many ways, Double Dragon for the NES is almost a completely different game. Not long after the release of the NES game, the title would arrive on Sega's 8-bit competitor, the Sega Master System, with this version of the game being published by Sega and developed by Arc System Works. Interestingly, the same company who, many years down the line, would end up owning the Double Dragon license itself. The Master System version was vastly superior to its NES counterpart, allowing up to 3 completely different enemy sprites to appear on screen simultaneously, instead of just one being duplicated into 2. More importantly, this version of the game allows for 2-player cooperative play, meaning that the title feels like an actual Double Dragon game. The levels are much closer to what could be found in the arcade version as well, but obviously still lack the same appeal as the arcade classic it was based off. Brilliant effort though, really. By 1990, the Game Boy would get a game titled Double Dragon, which played much like the NES game but featured stages that were completely different design-wise. It's a different game entirely based on the poor NES port. So maybe we should look at this one in depth later at some point. This one truly was something different altogether. But of course, being the late 80s, there was more gaming formats than just a couple of consoles, and a popular handheld. This was still the era whereby various micro and home computer formats occupied the homes of many. However, sadly, with the lack of a particularly dominant system, different versions of the game were outsourced and produced by various software houses, such as Ocean, Yuck, none of which were particularly special in quality. Let's refer to these low-budget, low-quality offerings as the Eurotrash Double Dragons, as most were made in the UK. By 1992, the game would finally arrive on 16-bit home consoles, released on an unlicensed third-party cartridge for the Sega Mega Drive. On the powerful 16-bit hardware, this game manages to fix some of the slowdown problems I mentioned with the arcade original. However, the game suffers from poor sound quality due to the cartridge only being 4MB, a limitation that was in place due to cost-cutting measures that hindered this port overall. Double Dragon came to the Atari Lynx in 1993, published by Telegames, the publisher who was keeping the Lynx on oxygen. It is ridiculously zoomed in though, and as a result, it is horrible to look at. This was the final conversion of the game in the classic Double Dragon era, and it's safe to say that if you're going to play this one, be safe and just go straight for the arcade original. While this classic is flawed in places, no one can deny that Double Dragon was a groundbreaking game that helped establish the beat-em-up genre and introduce new features like cooperative play and varied moves and combos. Its memorable characters, music and story have only further aided this pioneering brawler in forever holding its well-earned unforgettable place in video game history. This is why this one is so special. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe as I have plenty more videos on beat 'em up history for you to go out and enjoy. Don't be grumpy and hit that subscribe button now. I know what you retro gamers are like. Anyway, why not watch my documentary on Shredder's Revenge now? Yeah, cheerio.